So this is the discussion, I suppose, on what we talked about, or a process that we've come up with that would help in terms of peer discussion, formative feedback, some sort of peer tutorial or constructive discussion. And the idea here is this is a concept that we could actually apply for any assignment in any module. And we're trying to combine elements of discussion, formative feedback from peers, from the lecturers, and some sort of constructive confrontation. We're trying to combine all of those things together into an assignment, be it group or individual, and then how would you share the learnings post submission? That's the idea. So what we were proposing was that obviously the lecturer comes up with the assignment, whether it's group or whether it's individual. The assignment is given out to the learners initially. Obviously we're going to use standard templates, standard rubrics in terms of how that assignment is constructed, all of that kind of stuff. So the next thing we came up with this idea, we called it a Scum process because we were originally going to call it Scrum, but we spelled it wrong. So it's really about, imagine you've been given the assignment. Now what we want is a creative process where small groups can sit and discuss that assignment and discuss what's the best way, what's the expectation, what's the methodology, etc. So let's open this up a bit more. So the idea would be that they've been given the assignment. What happens is they get into small groups and they discuss, first of all, I suppose, the idea of peer learning. So, and the idea of constructive, being constructively critical as well. Okay, so if somebody comes up with an idea, it's okay to challenge it. It's okay to do that. The whole idea behind this discussion, first of all, is to understand the expectations of the assignment. Okay, and really what we're kind of saying to people here is, read the assignment. And like I said, there's a difference between reading the assignment, and reading assignment. They're different things. So, it's a bit like when you give somebody a job description and they're applying for a job, the first thing you want them to do is read the job description and really read it and then go back and read it again. So part of this discussion was get them to read the assignment, understand what's required, understand the expectations. What is the person looking for here? And you might even do it by giving them a dummy assignment in the same structure of the real one they're going to get. So if you give them the real one, the conversation might be around what's the answer. But really what we're trying to get them to do here is focus on what is the expected outcome, what is the quality of the outcome, what is the quantity in terms of the outcome, what would the structure of that outcome look like. So they would spend time discussing the learning outcomes. They would discuss the rubric. They would discuss what's the difference between a good one and a bad one. What would it look like? What would be the difference between a really bad one? And then they might discuss what are the milestones within that project, or within that assignment. What are the things you need to do? It must have an introduction. It must have a background. It must have a literature review. It must have a solution. It must have different stages in it. And it might talk about the methodology. It might talk about where to go, what places to look, what videos to watch. And in that whole process, people are giving themselves formative feedback, but also the lecturer can dip in as well and say, you'd need to include this, or that would need to be included, or that would need to be included. So the whole idea behind these small group discussions isn't to sit down and say, what's the answer here? But it's how would you approach it? What's the methodology? And we think this would work with maths just as much as it would work with developing a code, just as much as it would work with visualization or operational excellence. And it could lead either into the individual or the group assignment. So let's assume the outcome of that then is the individuals focus on their assignments or the group focus on their assignments. The assignments are then submitted. And then what we said is, you have two options here. So it's either an individual assignment that's submitted and that is assigned, or sorry, that's assessed by the lecturer based on obviously the criteria, but it's an individual. The other one obviously could be a group assignment, which will have an individual portion, which is corrected by the lecturer. There's a group portion, which is corrected by the lecturer, and then there's a peer portion, which is probably 5 or 10%, but that's done by the peers based on a defined criteria as well, which looks at levels of engagement, the ability for somebody to come with solutions, participation, all that kind of stuff. We did get into a conversation around this idea of, there was one more thing before we come to that. The idea then is, obviously once the assignments are all submitted, what we were proposing is that we would come up with a peer learning process. And the peer learning process would be, we would share the assignments with the entire group after the submission date, maybe after things were corrected. So you didn't have the option of going back and revising your submission based on finding a better one. And there's a difference between peer learning and peer rating or peer grading. So we got into that conversation and we talked about this idea that, maybe having some sort of a peer rating process would be good, whereby, let's say, for example, a learner would look at 4 or 5 other assignments and somehow critique those in terms of quality and discussion and all that kind of stuff. We kind of came to a conclusion logistically that would be very difficult to do, but maybe where we said is that would become a better assignment maybe in the transversal skills module, because in there what we could do is we could construct a much bigger assignment which looks at transversal skills really about an individual's ability to make sense of something. We could give them an article on a topic and we could ask them to go off and critique that article and look at where did the data come from, and get into a group discussion around, is that data valid? Is the argument valid? And in there, I think you could have a form of, peer rating, etc. as well. So more than likely, I think we would be able to assess that particular competency in the transversal skills module rather than trying to do it in all the other modules. So I suppose what we're saying here is the upshot of it, of our Scum model here, is this could be a model that we would propose as a methodology, such that anytime any assignment is given out, this is a good mechanism to allow people to have discussion, to allow peer tutorial and lecturer-fed tutorial. It allows formative feedback to happen, either from peers or from lecturers. It also helps to clarify the expectations of the assignment. The focus is not on what's the answer. That's not the idea. The focus is on how do you get to the answer? How do you construct? What's the methodology to develop that? And as a learning mechanism and as a formative feedback mechanism, it would be easy to do. We'd break people up into groups of 4 or 5 or 6, and they would discuss that, and we would give them a very defined structure. And then that would set them up well. It would clarify any issues around understanding what's required in the assignment. And then when it's submitted either as individual or group, we would have a defined marking scheme, and then we would share we could share all of the assignments after the submission date, so people could use that as a learning exercise as well. But they obviously couldn't go back and influence their own submission at that stage. And the last part was this idea of this peer discussion, which we said we would build more and more into the transversal skills module. So we could have a greater peer marking, greater peer grading in that process based on a bigger group discussion. So that was kind of the summary. I think it was easier to articulate it rather than trying to write it in a document. But I think the idea would be that maybe what we would describe this as a model, and we would describe this in the body of the document itself as a methodology that touches on a range of teaching and learning methods. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense, and we'll see where it takes us.